In the early 1960s, the world was a pressurized vessel, humming with the low-frequency vibration of imminent catastrophe. The Cold War had moved beyond the era of grand post-war rebuilding and into a shadowy, claustrophobic stalemate. In the corridors of Langley and the fortified rooms of the Kremlin, the conflict wasn't just being fought with the looming threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles or the posturing of naval fleets. It was being fought in the silence between words. It was an era of profound, clinical paranoia. This wasn't the frantic panic of a battlefield. It was a cold, calculated desperation that seeped into every floorboard of every embassy. In Washington, the intelligence community was convinced, rightly so, that the Soviet Union had turned every official building into a giant ear. In Moscow, the Politburo operated under the constant shadow of the invisible American. Every conversation mattered. A casual remark about a grain shipment, a hushed debate over a submarine's propulsion system, or a momentary lapse in a diplomat's composure, any of these could shift the balance of nuclear power. The stakes were binary: absolute information or absolute destruction. The Central Intelligence Agency found itself at a technological and tactical crossroads. They needed a way to penetrate the inner sanctums of the Soviet elite, places where even the most seasoned human intelligence, HUMINT, assets couldn't go. They needed a fly on the wall. But flies are difficult to control, and walls are easily swept for bugs. The agency needed something that existed in the white space of human perception, something that moved through the world unnoticed, unquestioned, and completely invisible to the rigid security protocols of the KGB. It was in this environment of high-stakes absurdity that a group of scientists and case officers within the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, DST, gathered. They were looking for the ultimate low-profile platform. And then someone proposed an idea so surreal, so profoundly bizarre, that it initially hung in the air like a joke that no one dared laugh at. What if the spy was a cat? By 1960, the golden age of classic surveillance was hitting a brick wall. The romanticized image of the trench-coat-wearing spy with a miniature camera was rapidly becoming an artifact of the past. The technology of the time was constantly playing a game of cat and mouse, literally, with countermeasures. The primary issue was the environment. Soviet embassies and high-security residences were hard targets. They were swept daily by technicians using non-linear junction detectors. Rooms were shielded with copper mesh to create Faraday cages. Human agents, no matter how well trained, were biological liabilities. They had heart rates that spiked, eyes that wandered, and loyalties that could be bought or broken. A man standing too long on a street corner was a red flag. A microphone hidden in a flower pot was a matter of time before a gardener found it. The Soviets were masters of the sweep. They understood the geometry of surveillance. They knew where a man would hide a microphone and where a directional dish would be aimed. They were looking for the artificial. They were looking for the mechanical. But there was one thing no one suspected. There was one element of the urban landscape that the KGB, for all its ruthless efficiency, completely ignored. No one searches a stray animal. Think about the streets of a major city in the 1960s. Cats were everywhere. They were the background noise of the urban environment. They lounged on the warm hoods of black ZIL limousines. They stalked mice in the shadows of the Soviet compound's gardens. They sat on the very park benches where high-ranking officials met to exchange secrets in private. To a counterintelligence officer, a cat was a non-entity. It was a biological prop. It had no political allegiance. It couldn't be interrogated. It didn't carry a passport. To the CIA planners, this wasn't insanity. It was the ultimate camouflage. It was a way to put a sophisticated listening station exactly 3 feet from a Soviet general and have that general reach down and stroke the device without ever realizing he was broadcasting to a CIA van 2 blocks away. The acoustic kitty was born not from a whim, but from the realization that in the world of secrets, the most effective tool is the one that looks like it belongs nowhere and everywhere at once. The program was officially christened Project Acoustic Kitty. It sounds like a code name from a satirical novel, but inside the DST, it was treated with the same clinical rigor as the development of the U-2 spy plane or the first reconnaissance satellites. Unofficially, the skeptics within the agency called it madness. They pointed out the obvious: cats are notoriously uncooperative. They're not dogs. They don't live to please. But the proponents of the project were buoyed by the can-do spirit of 1960s American engineering. They believed that if they could put a man on the moon, they could certainly put a radio in a tabby. The plan was breathtaking in its complexity and its total lack of regard for feline anatomy. This wasn't going to be a cat wearing a collar. A collar can be seen. A collar can be removed. No, the spy was to be the equipment. The technical requirements were grueling. The microphone. A miniature microphone had to be surgically implanted deep within the cat's ear canal. The ear itself would act as a natural collection dish, focusing sound waves directly into the sensor. The power source, a small battery and transmitter, had to be housed within the cat's chest cavity. This required a level of miniaturization that was at the absolute bleeding edge of 1960s electronics. The wiring. A fine, hair-thin wire had to be threaded from the ear down the neck and under the skin of the spine to connect the microphone to the transmitter. The antenna. Perhaps most incredible of all, the cat's long, expressive tail was to be utilized as the antenna. A fine wire would be woven through the fur or just beneath the skin of the tail to ensure a clear signal was broadcast to the monitors. This wasn't a conceptual drawing on a chalkboard. This was a funded, approved, and deadly serious multi-million-dollar operation. The CIA wasn't just looking for a cat. They were looking to create a living, breathing cyborg. They recruited top-tier veterinary surgeons and electronic engineers. They spent months in secret laboratories refining the installation process. They had to ensure the cat could move naturally, that the heat from the vacuum tubes, and later early transistors, wouldn't burn the animal, and that the equipment wouldn't be rejected by the cat's immune system. But as the technical hurdles were cleared, a much larger, more fundamental problem loomed over the project. You can build the most sophisticated bug in the world, but if the delivery system decides it would rather chase a butterfly or take a nap in a sunbeam than sit next to a Soviet diplomat, the mission is a failure. The transition from a conceptual acoustic kitty to a living, breathing prototype was a journey into the macabre. The agency's Directorate of Science and Technology bypassed standard intelligence protocols and entered the realm of experimental surgery. For several years, a secret laboratory, shrouded in the same level of security as the Manhattan Project, became the site of a bizarre collaboration. On one side of the table stood the world's leading veterinarians, on the other, master electronic engineers and acoustics experts. Together, they treated the feline body not as a living creature, but as a chassis for the most advanced surveillance hardware ever conceived. The surgery alone was an ordeal that took years to perfect. The primary challenge was the internal environment of a mammal. The feline body is a warm, acidic, and constantly moving ecosystem, none of which is friendly to 1960s-era electronics. Engineers had to develop specialized coatings for the wires to prevent them from corroding or causing massive infections. The technicians worked with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. They began by hollowing out a space in the cat's ear canal to house a miniature microphone, which was smaller than a grain of rice. From there, they had to thread a wire through the neck and down the delicate architecture of the spine. The power source, a battery that had to be small enough to be unobtrusive yet powerful enough to transmit a signal through urban interference, was nestled inside the chest cavity. Finally, a hair-thin wire was woven through the length of the tail to serve as a biological antenna. The cat survived procedures that no animal was ever meant to endure. In the sterile light of the lab, it was a triumph of engineering, a cat that looked entirely ordinary on the outside, but was a complex network of batteries, wiring, and miniature electronics on the inside. But building the cat was the easy part. The scientists soon realized that while they had mastered the hardware, they had no control over the software, the feline brain. Controlling the cat was a nightmare that defied every logic of the intelligence community. In the CIA, every asset is expected to follow a chain of command, but cats don't follow orders. They don't care about the ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. They're entirely indifferent to the nuclear brinkmanship of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Training took months of grueling repetition. CIA handlers tried everything: positive reinforcement, ultrasonic cues, food rewards. They attempted to program the cat to move towards the sound of human voices and sit still for extended periods. Millions of dollars vanished into these training sessions, and yet the cat remained a cat. If it felt a breeze, it would wander off to find a sheltered spot. If it smelled a trash can, it would abandon its mission for a scrap of fish. The project was fighting against millions of years of predatory instinct, and the instinct was winning. By the mid-1960s, despite the erratic results of the training, the pressure from Langley was immense. The project had cost an estimated $20 million, roughly $180 million in today's currency. The bean counters and the directors wanted a return on their investment. They wanted a proof of concept in the field. The CIA decided to move forward with a live test in the heart of Washington, D.C. The target was high value, two Soviet diplomats who were known to meet for sensitive discussions on a park bench outside the Soviet embassy compound on Wisconsin Avenue. It was a classic dead-drop environment, too open for hidden microphones, too public for a human agent to stand nearby without being burned. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. A surveillance van, disguised as a common delivery truck, pulled up to the curb. Inside, technicians sat with headphones on, their fingers hovering over reel-to-reel recorders. The handlers opened the back door, and the carrier was positioned. The objective? The cat would be released, it would cross the street, stroll towards the park bench, and sit quietly near the diplomats. Its internal transmitter would beam their conversation back to the van. The handler opened the carrier door. The cat, now a multi-million-dollar piece of government property, stepped out onto the pavement. It paused, sniffing the air, its bionic ear twitching towards the sound of the Russian voices. It walked forward, towards the grassy verge of the park. And then the unthinkable happened. As the cat stepped into the road, a common yellow taxi, one of thousands in the D.C. fleet, came barreling down the avenue. There was no time to react. In a sickening instant of screeching tires and a dull thud, the mission ended. The world's most expensive spy was gone. The wires, the batteries, and the years of surgical refinement were crushed under a Michelin tire. The mission didn't just fail, it vanished in a moment of mundane urban tragedy. The illusion of the perfect spy was shattered instantly. The technicians in the van sat in stunned silence, listening to the static on their headsets where the secrets of the Soviet Union were supposed to be. In the aftermath of the Wisconsin Avenue disaster, the CIA's internal review was swift and merciless. A 1967 memo, later declassified, put a clinical end to the madness. It praised the scientific achievement of the project, but admitted that the practical difficulties of training a cat to perform in the field were insurmountable. Officially, Project Acoustic Kitty was labeled a failure. Unofficially, it was buried in the deepest vaults of the agency, a source of embarrassment that no one wanted to explain to Congress. Millions of taxpayer dollars had been spent. Years of the nation's brightest minds had been diverted. And what was recovered? Nothing. Not a single word of Soviet intel, not a single secret. But the legacy of the cat isn't about the technology or the failure of the mission. It is a window into the psyche of an era. The project revealed a CIA that had reached a point of absolute psychological saturation. They were living in a world where the threat of total annihilation was so constant that the line between genius and insanity had completely dissolved. In the 1960s, any idea, no matter how absurd, no matter how cruel or surreal, was considered acceptable as long as it promised even a 1% advantage over the Soviets. If the enemy was everywhere, then the spies had to be everything. The Cold War wasn't just a period of dangerous military posturing. It was a period of profound desperation, where the most powerful nation on Earth tried to turn a house pet into a weapon of war, only to be defeated by a taxi driver who was just trying to make his shift. In the end, Acoustic Kitty serves as a reminder that even in the high-stakes world of international espionage, nature and the sheer chaos of reality has a way of asserting itself against the best-laid plans of men. To understand why men in suits and lab coats spent 5 years and a fortune on Project Acoustic Kitty, you have to understand the specific, suffocating brand of terror that defined the early 1960s. This wasn't just a story about animal experimentation or a bizarre footnote in a budget report. Acoustic Kitty was a symptom of a world vibrating with the frequency of fear. At its core, the project wasn't about animals at all. It was about the terrifying weight of the unknown. In the intelligence community of 1961, the nightmare scenario wasn't just a surprise missile launch, it was the conversation that preceded it. There was a pervasive, bone-deep fear of missing the one sentence, the one whispered aside, or the one sighed confession that could signal the end of the world. The CIA was operating under the belief that the Soviet Union was a monolithic, impenetrable wall. Behind that wall, decisions were being made that could turn American cities into ash. Every time a Soviet diplomat walked into a park or a high-ranking official leaned in to whisper to a colleague, the CIA felt a literal, physical pull of desperation. They were technologically outmatched in the human theater of Moscow and D.C. They had the U-2 planes taking photos from 70,000 feet, but they didn't have the words being spoken on the ground. This created a vacuum. And in the world of intelligence, a vacuum is always filled with the most radical ideas available. If training a cat to spy sounded reasonable to the top brass at Langley, if they could sit in a wood-paneled briefing room, look at a diagram of a cat's tail being used as a radio antenna, and nod in solemn agreement, it meant the world had already gone mad. It meant that the baseline for sanity had shifted so far toward the edge of the abyss that the absurd had become the pragmatic. The project represented the total surrender of logic to the altar of total information awareness. The CIA was willing to play God with biology, to rewire a living creature into a machine, because the alternative, not knowing what was being said on a park bench, was deemed a greater risk to national security than the loss of their own moral or scientific compass. The cat was a mirror. It reflected a government so haunted by the specter of nuclear fire that they looked at a stray animal and saw a weapon of war. They looked at a pet and saw a frequency. They looked at nature and saw a missed opportunity for surveillance. Today, the story of Acoustic Kitty is often told as a punchline. It's the wacky story in the history of the Cold War, a brief moment of levity in a dark era. People laugh at the image of a bionic cat being defeated by a taxicab, but inside the halls of modern intelligence agencies, the NSA, the FSB, the Mossad, the story is studied with a much more somber lens. It is studied because it proves something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of power. When a nation believes its survival depends entirely on information, there is no such thing as too far. There is no boundary that won't be crossed. not the boundary of ethics, where we question the morality of our methods, not the boundary of logic, where we ask if a plan is even physically possible, not even the boundary of reality itself. Acoustic Kitty was the precursor to the modern era of unconventional warfare. It was the grandfather of the insect-sized drones we see today, the biohacking experiments of the 21st century, and the mass digital surveillance that vacuums up billions of private conversations every hour. The technology has changed. We've moved from copper wires in a cat's spine to algorithms in a smartphone, but the impulse remains identical. The lesson of the project is that fear is the ultimate architect of the absurd. In the Cold War, even a house cat wasn't safe from being drafted into the struggle for global dominance. It wasn't turned into a cyborg because it made sense. It was turned into a cyborg because the people in charge were too terrified to say no to any idea that offered a glimmer of an advantage. The tragedy of the project isn't just the millions wasted or the animal lost. It's the realization that when humanity enters a state of perpetual high-stakes conflict, everything in our world, the trees, the air, the animals, and eventually ourselves, is viewed through the cold, calculating eye of a lens. The cat didn't die for a cause. It died because two empires were so afraid of each other that they lost sight of what made their world worth saving in the first place. Project Acoustic Kitty remains a ghost in the machine of history, a reminder that when we become obsessed with hearing every whisper, we often lose the ability to hear our own common sense.